Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hancock here with Professor Peter Redpath returning, and a special visitor, Professor Curtis Hancock. Today, we'll be talking mostly about metaphysics, but politics will be waiting in the wings. Let's open, as always, with prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Before our conversation begins, an introductory note is in order for Professor Curtis Hancock. He's the coordinator of the concentration and the history of philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. And he taught for 32 years at Rockhurst Jesuit University in Kansas, which made him something of a neighbor of our friends Brendan Sweetman, and a neighbor as well of Mario Ramos-Reyes.
Yes.
Now, for over a decade, he taught, that's not Mario, but Curtis, great books discussions, and online homeschooling program. And let me just slip in here that next year's annual American Maritime Association is having the equivalent of a plenary presentation on Thomism and the great books. We'll be mostly talking about metaphysics, and let's get started. What is metaphysics about? If somebody says, what's geology about, we can tell them. If somebody says something like, what's biology about, we have an answer, but it's open to you, Peter, and open to you, Curtis, and I'll pick at you if I'm not satisfied. What is metaphysics about?
Well, if we follow what St. Thomas says regarding it, since he refers to it as a science, in fact, queen of the sciences, it's about a genus, and this is where you start to get into trouble in trying to make it intelligible, because as Father Armand de Mauer has indicated, related to the teaching of St. Thomas, citing St. Thomas's commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, Book 5, Lesson 22. The genus of the philosopher is not the genus of the logician. And most of the people who are students of St. Thomas, when they approach his understanding of metaphysics, will start to get students very confused by saying things like it studies being as being, or ens und quantum ens, and they will focus attention on his work, his logical work called the Categories, where what they're focusing attention on is an abstract concept of being, and as it first falls into the intellect, right? In which it has nothing. It can't be a genus because it can't be divided by anything, because Other than being, you have non-being. So they wind up in this Parmenidean understanding of being and logic from which they can't approach an understanding of it. But if you take what St. Thomas says in his commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, as well as in his commentary on the De Trinitate of Boethius, it's clear that St. Thomas is talking about being considered as an organizational whole. You see this also in the beginning of his Summa Theologia, where he talks about theology, right, as a science, and he refers to it as God talk, where it's the science of God. Right? And now God is being, qua being. Right? So, in a sense, revealed theology studies being as a genius. And what St. Thomas means by this is that it studies a multitude of different things related to God. Just like in medicine, a medical doctor, the subject of the medical doctor is health-related being. It's a multitude of things that related to health in different ways. Or politics is related to peace and war in a multitude of ways, and economics is related to wealth. Okay? So the metaphysician is not studying being as some sort of abstract concept, but what St. Thomas calls common being. Right? That is, St. Thomas is considering, just like the medical doctor studying common health, studying, or the economist is studying commonwealth. It's wealth that is being commonly related to as the chief subject about which you're talking, right? That is possessed by a multitude of beings in an unequal way. As St. Thomas indicates, a real genius is composed of contrary opposites, and it's divided by unequal possession of that chief subject through that what Plato introduced into philosophy, that notion of participation. It studies beings that have this or that. So metaphysics is, according to St. Thomas, a psychological habit. Right? Because science is a psychological habit. And what it's studying is an organizational whole, a composite whole made up of anything that is said to have being. Just like economics studies anything that is related to talk about wealth, and medicine, anything related to talk about health.
Let me interrupt here for a second, Peter, and do so by an appeal to our late and truly great friend, Father Jim Schaal. And as you know, it was your idea, dedicated one of our panel sessions to Father Schaal. This was shortly after he died. Now, Father Schaal was fond of a phrase, and I think he would use it probably at least once in every one of his essays, and the phrase was, that which is. Mm-hmm. Suppose we take that which is as reality, and suppose we think of metaphysics as the effort, because it sure takes effort, to grasp the fundamental structures of reality. Metaphysics as the effort to grasp the fundamental structures of reality, of that which is. How's that, in your view, as an understanding of metaphysics?
Well, I think it's well, it's correct. It's from a generic standpoint. In introducing students to what metaphysics is, I think it's a little too abstract. In Latin, it's id quod est. Anything that has existence, metaphysics would study. I think if you focus attention on the fact that every science, which St. Thomas considered to be identical with philosophy, is a psychological habit. It's chiefly a habit of the soul. It's not a logical system. It's not a body of knowledge. But it's this psychological disposition to be interested in, to be focusing your attention on one qualitatively different organizational whole or another. Like Aristotle says, every science takes a part of being and studies that part. But metaphysics, every other science does this, but metaphysics studies being qua being. And metaphysics studies organizational wholes considered as organizational wholes. That is, the chief aim of engaging in any scientific or philosophical study is to discover the principles and causes, right, of this or that organizational whole, being that organizational whole and acting the way it does. It studies its existence, unity, and action. That's what you want to focus attention on, right?
All right, now let's see what Curtis has to add or subtract to that.
Logicians, by the way, don't...
Go ahead.
Yes. I think Peter came close to a summary of his basic view of what metaphysics is about. Do you have anything to add or subtract? Qualify?
Well, I would
qualify? It's a mix with quantify.
I would just complement what Peter says by a perspective that my former mentor, my dissertation director, Leo Sweeney, Jesuit at Loyola of Chicago, where I studied, in class, he used to try to begin talking about metaphysics in two ways. He would say, keep in mind that philosophy is a question-asking discipline, a question-asking endeavor, going all the way back to how the ancient Greeks approached it. And he said, in light of that, the way to get a perspective on metaphysics is to ask two questions. First question is, what is it to be real? The metaphysician wants to know what thing is actual or ultimately actual in the universe, in all of reality. And you can see how philosophers, if you look at the history of philosophy, they divide on that question. Some are very extreme and say, well, the only thing that's real is matter. That's a materialist. Another says the only thing that's real are ideas, and that's the idealist. Bertrand Russell always had fun with that when he said, if you look at the history of philosophy, it seems to come down to two things: no matter, never mind. That was his way of kind of dismissing the whole dialogue. And then you might ask, as Peter's talking about, is what's actual existence or is it essence? And then there's the pantheist, who says the only thing that's real is God, and everything else just an illusion. So one way to get a kind of a perspective on it is to stay grounded in that question: what is it to be real? What is to be ultimately actual? And the other way to think of metaphysics is to ask a question: what kinds of beings does the whole of reality consist of? And this is where metaphysics gets its name, because metaphysics is open to the possibility that there's something that exists beyond matter, metaphysica, beyond matter, beyond physics, beyond the matter of the natural world. And so are you open to the possibility there might be human souls, there might be angels, there might be God, and that's God, freedom, and immortality. That's the traditional debate in philosophy. So that's one way, when you're talking to students, to kind of get them into the conversation about metaphysics, which in no way contradicts anything Dr. Redpath said. It just, as I said, complements what he's saying.
Well, what if some pushy student, I've heard them called snarky. But what if some pushy, snarky, intellectually inquisitive student says, well, there's been a lot of talk about reality, and I'm all for it, whatever it is, but given that I'm a eensy-weensy part of reality, how am I supposed to understand or even begin to understand the whole of reality? Can an ant, say, really understand the whole of the building that it is entered into surreptitiously? Why, with regard to the whole of reality, I'm smaller than an ant, so how am I supposed to do what you folks want me to do?
Well, one way I respond to students who ask something like that is I say, we already have a common sense intuition that there's something more than just matter. Even when you ask a question like that, when we have a conversation, there's something going on that transcends matter. And remember, that's what metaphysics means, ultimately, some way in which something non-physical has to be factored in to do justice to the reality of the issue. Because like this conversation we're having right now, scientists, remember, physical science studies the behavior of matter. That's what it studies. But if you think about like the conversation we're having right now, the conversation we would have with a student, a snarky student who would ask that question, you can say back, well, when we are exchanging information, when we communicate with each other, which is what happens in a conversation, there's something more than just the physics of the event. So when I have a conversation, I vibrate my vocal cords, which vibrates the air. But when you hear what I'm saying, you realize that that vibration produces a design in the air. And if you know the English language, you know that that vibration is a sign of the meaning that I'm trying to convey to your mind because you understand the language. But meaning is not something that a scientist could access. A scientist could come in and measure the vibration of the air, and all the physics of wave theory that goes with that. In fact, someone once asked Albert Einstein if he thought science could explain everything, and he used the example of a Beethoven symphony. Well, it could explain a Beethoven symphony in terms of sound and wave theory, but it wouldn't be music. And in a conversation, there is meaning and truth, and that is not something that can be captured in the net of physical scientific measurement. So even in ordinary life, even in common sense experience, and remember, William James said of scholastic philosophy that scholastic philosophy is just the Vassar-trained older sister of common sense. That's how he put it. Scholastic philosophy tries to appeal to our common sense intuitions and then draw out their important conclusions. And so even in ordinary experience, we have an intuition that there's something metaphysical taking place. The fact that we can exchange meanings and truth in a conversation. And truth and meaning is not something that's just matter.
Now, this conversation to which you call our attention, starting with the conversation with the student, that's real. And we can look to what it presupposes and what its goal is, but it's a conversation. Could we say that insofar as a conversation involves a relation between two people or more than two people, could we say that we are looking at a kind of relational realism, as opposed to, say, an absolute realism which we somehow figure out on our own, and since we can't really figure it out, we give up on, and we're modest in a sense that we do our philosophy talking to each other, and we certainly think that we're there talking to each other, and so we are relational realists.
Well, I think Dr. Redpath can tell you, and I'll let him take this up, but I think part of the genius of classical metaphysics was it understood that relations were real. One of the byproducts or one of the outcomes of the kind of nominalism of modern thought, where they're just individuals, they're just bits of matter explained mechanistically. There are no relations, and that changes everything. Part of the genius of Christianity is that there's personalism, that we are, by our very nature, persons. To be a person is to relate. That's why there's a Trinity. There's a God as three persons, and we're made in the image and likeness of that personhood. And so when a conversation is going on, understanding it as a kind of relatedness is not just a metaphor. That's real, because in reality, there are more than just bits of matter. There are relations between things. A son is related to his mother, not just by the fact that there's some kind of physical proximity. Maternity is a real relationship. Sonship is a real relationship. And that's just a way in which classical metaphysics looks at the world differently from modernism.
Anything to say about that, Peter? Yes, go ahead.
That's a very good point, because the term that is generally used in Latin for relation is habitus, and the metaphysics studies habens esse, what has, anything that has existence, but. In approaching it first from the standpoint of studying, focusing attention on reality, well, this is true. I found more success with students by focusing attention on the fact that the metaphysics studies organizational wholes. If the student wants to object to what you're saying, the student's going to have to unify thought. Is going to have to order. Is going to have to organize what that student is saying. Right? Cannot try to respond in a way that has no organizational unity. As St. Thomas says, as Gilson keenly noted. The only kind of unity that a multitude can have is one of order. And repeatedly, St. Thomas says, the office of the wise man is to know order, to set things in order and govern them well, right? Order, however, only exists within an organizational whole. What we first know is being, but we know it as in terms of unity. We know it in terms of a composite whole. We don't know it as an absolute perfection. What we first sense are not individuals, as St. Thomas recognized and Gilson knew, but most contemporary students of St. Thomas do not know and repeatedly mislead their students about, is what we first sense is a genus. Okay? And that's the sense in which we sense reality. We sense something. Right? Then we sense animal. Then we sense daddy or mommy. Right? And so Gilson's in a later work says related to that, look, if we don't sense real genera and real species, why do we say, I see a horse, for example? That's our first awareness. Our first awareness, and this is why I focus attention on, is of a composite whole, a duality considered as a unity. Metaphysics studies being qua being in the sense that it studies being as some sort of a unity, right? Where a multitude, just like every science does, it takes a multitude, right, that is related to some chief subject of interest, something you're interested about most, and tries to identify the parts that are related to each other and how they are related to generate this whole and the way it acts. All science does that. Now, once you return to that understanding of science, all of the sciences, right, that had been fragmented by nominalism and reduced in modernity to what Professor Hancock was talking about, physical science, as if this is the whole of science, that understanding becomes destroyed. So does the history of Western intellectual history. You have to completely reinterpret it and go back to a proper understanding of it. But this is what science chiefly studies.
Okay, now we're back in the classroom. We're back in the classroom, and there we are looking at rapt students, and one of them, Snarky Sam, says,
Mr.
I hear all that talk about science and organization, and do you hear me? I hear it. And suppose I couldn't hear it, then I'd be in trouble. But I suppose you'd help me out. You'd give me the book, right? You'd give me the book. But suppose I couldn't see, and well, then I couldn't see it. But you teachers are great. You'd help me out. You'd give me something that was in Braille. But suppose I couldn't touch. Suppose I couldn't feel anything. Suppose I had no tactile capacity. Then look, I'd really be stuck. So insofar as we're having this conversation, says Snarky Sam, we're all of us depending on our sense experiences. And if you go to qualify that in some way or another, I wouldn't know you were qualifying it apart from sense experiences. And you wouldn't even be able to tell that I was snarky apart from your sense experiences. So whatever we're going to do in our organizational efforts, aren't we going to have to do it within the context of our sense experiences? And hasn't it been the case that science has made incredible advances because it's recognized this, and wherever possible it's shed its metaphysical regalia from yesteryear and focuses on the ordering of sense experiences? And suppose Snarky Sam has in that little speech electrified Emile the empiricist, and Emile the empiricist says, yeah. So what would we say to such a rant, Peter and Curtis?
Well, you just admitted that the scientist, or the person you call a scientist, I don't call him a scientist, strictly speaking, except to the extent that that person is ordering. As you included in what you just said.
But can the ordering involve any apparatus apart from sense experiences that we can exchange with one another by way of the senses?
Senses as such don't order anything. To understand order is to understand unity.
Well, listen here. Doesn't the visual experience give us something different than the auditory experience? And
multitudes.
Doesn't that involve two different orders?
It gives you multitudes. As Gilson says, we sense with our intellects. It's the intellect that apprehends different orders, different unities in multitudes.
All right, so we get data in with the senses, but we don't get any order.
Right.
Order requires something more than that.
Yeah, the senses tell you how things are different in a way, but to be different means to be the same. The only way you can understand the distinctions and differences is to put those distinctions and differences within a common unity or category, as some people would say.
Okay, now here's somebody who's repeating the course from last year. Repetitious Randy. And Repetitious Randy says, in these here courses I've been taking with you guys, there are these distinctions between the intellect and the senses. And the way I'm responding to this more and more, says this former student, is I don't know. You say that the intellect orders the senses, but it seems to me that you define them in such a way that there's a gap that can't be crossed between the two. How is the intellect going to get into sensation land to do anything at all?
Well, Dr. Redpath implicitly replied to that when he said we intellectualize with our senses and we sense with our intellect. You see, what Randy is doing is he's separating, discriminating between the faculties in such a way as to create the idea they're completely discrete entities unto themselves. We're all grounded in the same embodied person.
Professor Hancock, would you remind him of Jacques Maritain's term, intelligentiated senses?
That's right. That it's a
and
way.
Would you refresh his memory about what the devil that means?
Well, Maritain would go back to his idea of true humanism, of integral humanism. That remember that philosophy has to originate in the awarenesses of the common sense human person, and we are embodied persons. We're a soul in a body. It's not like we have this intellect, this old Platonic Augustinian view. We got some kind of ghost in a machine. We are an embodied person, and we relate to our world primarily through our senses. But when we have an intellectual insight into what things are signified as and how they're intelligible in the world that our senses grasp, and through abstraction we can draw out of that sense experience, that sense content, the meanings of things, and put that in our intellect. But it's not like our intellect and our senses don't go together. They're embodied in one and the same person. We're back to personalism. And once you lose personalism, the whole thing gets messed up, because there's a tendency to look at the faculties of the human person as discrete parts. When I go to a concert, I don't send my ears to the concert. The whole person goes to the concert, and that person is using his auditory faculties. So when I know my world, I mainly know it through the vehicle of the senses, but my intellect obtains information from the senses. And so it goes together. It's not like they're two different parts of you.
Okay, now here's another student. They're starting to come alive here. Cussed Carl. Cussed Carl says, well, okay, senses, intellect, intelligentiated senses, that's wonderful. In fact, says Cussed Carl, I'm not so cussed as you might think, because I have in past philosophy courses developed a richer consciousness than I ever thought I could. But it's all within my consciousness. Anything that comes about by way of philosophy remains within the consciousness of the philosopher. And so, in fact, anything we do in metaphysics is really a kind of an exploration of our own consciousness. And long live altered consciousness. See me after class. What about that?
Well, that's a good point. It's a kind of truism, but he didn't want to commit the George Berkeley fallacy, where he thinks that because the only way I know things is always through my consciousness, that's all that exists. It's what's in my consciousness. See, that's the dangerous fallacy that sometimes people step into. And I hope Carl's not making that fallacy.
I mean, Berkeley says it doesn't change anything. You haven't lost anything. Everything you ever had, you still have. You just got to recognize that it's within your consciousness.
Right. Of course, you've lost the real world, but
well, but it's as real. The world is as real as it's ever going to be, but it's just within your consciousness.
Well,
and you say to that cussed Carl, you are cussed Carl, and here's why. What do you say to that guy?
What you've done is you've destroyed the formal object of the science. The external subject that activates your faculties. You've gotten rid of the notion of a faculty psychology, for one thing, and you've turned psychology into a logic. You've turned philosophy into a logic. You've turned it into a kind of systematic logic, where you're studying ideas that are ideas about ideas, that are signs which are signs of signs which are signs of nothing. You've destroyed real relation, as Dr. Hancock has indicated. And if you're Christians, you've destroyed the human person as possessing an embodied soul. So Bishop Berkeley should have known better.
Well, what about the late Edmund Husserl? Suppose we have a friend of Husserl, and the friend of Husserl says, Well, the fact of the matter is, I started this wonderful form of philosophy called phenomenology, and it's rigorous. It puts aside everything except for consciousness in the spirit of Descartes, except I'm going to go beyond that, and I'm going to say what we need to do is put all these metaphysical considerations that you've been introducing to one side and just look at the structure of consciousness. And there's plenty of work to do here. And this individual might even say, and besides, Professor Smith in another course told me this is the way to go.
Yeah, there's always a Smith that's trouble somewhere. Well, you have the same problem that you have with Berkeley. This doesn't help in any way. What you're doing is you're taking out of the real subject to study its principles of organization, right? What you're attempting to understand as a scientist is how the organizations that we apprehend around us in the physical universe. This is always what we're brought back to. Everything that we know, we know from first sensing real being and sensing it generically, and then trying to figure out what are its specific and individual causes. Right? The causes of organizations. Right? Now, once you grant that they exist, what you're doing is you're studying the acting nature, right? And you're abstractly studying it. Right? So, in a sense, that's true. Once you admit that your subject exists, right? You're going to a dentist, for example, and you admit the dentist recognizes that real teeth exist. Huh? Then you can focus attention abstractly, right, on common aspects of that thing. But what you're trying to figure out, what you're trying to imagine, from which you're getting your concepts, is how one part is related to another part, and how all of the parts are related to a whole, and how the whole is related to a single action, right? That is the chief action of this organization. Organizational wholes and the way they operate. Right? Now, somebody like Husserl is abstracting from that, okay, and pretending that it's of a secondary import. But that's the crucial aspect of the whole reason you're engaging in this in this enterprise.
That's right, Jim. And also Husserl, remember Husserl's first book, if I recall, was on the Cartesian Meditations.
Right.
So Husserl is very much enmeshed in the modernist project, where he's going to try to trick out of skepticism some way of knowledge. But once you start, as Gilson and Mary Tam pointed out long ago, once you start that way, skepticism leads you down a cul-de-sac, and you won't get out of it. It will not bear fruit. So you'll be just stuck with kind of ruminating through consciousness.
Well, would this be a teachable moment, especially for Thomists, to distinguish between reflection on essences, even essential structures of consciousness, to distinguish between essence and existence? Well, I know of one Thomist who said you can't really be a metaphysician unless you have an intuition of existence.
I've heard that guy, yeah.
Yeah. Continue, gentlemen. Please continue. How are we going to distinguish between essence and existence? And why is it so important?
Well, let me just set it up this way, and I'll deflect to Peter here. I'll defer to Peter.
No, don't do that. It just gives him more, I don't know what.
Okay. Give him another excuse, right?
Right.
Well, again, referring back to my mentor, Leo Sweeney, he used to say that, again, from common sense point of view, we, again, have an intuition that there's a difference between essence and existence. Everybody does, because when you tell a child what something is, the child himself or herself knows that doesn't necessarily commit you to the conclusion that it is. So if I talk about
that old Santa Claus issue comes up.
The old Santa Claus issue. Exactly. So in a way, again, we're back to the point that you have to always anchor yourself back in common sense experience and go from there. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, this is very good. I would put it, instead of using the term intuition, although I think it's applicable, it's fitting, is induction. We don't prove the existence of a distinction between existence, that something is, and what it is. We induce it, right? Immediately, right? And that's why you can't prove a real distinction between what something is and the fact that it is. This is glaringly apprehended in the first act of knowing, and logicians tend to think that induction is this reasoning from particulars to universals. No, it's not. Okay, induction is knowing the organization you're dealing with right from the beginning, right, and recognizing its existence, and trying to determine what's causing it to act the way that it does, finding out the principles of this or that organization. What the metaphysicians try to do is find out what are the principles of all organizational wholes. Right? What's universal? This is why it's the chief leadership science. Right? To the extent that you know that you're able to identify the part-whole relationships that are causing organizations to generate their distinctive kinds of actions, you are possessed in some way of science.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that you know the principles that are contained in all organizational wholes, you can immediately induce whether or not somebody is barking up a wrong trail. For example, somebody comes along and says, well, that's not empirically verifiable, for example. Therefore, it has to be false. Well, to me, there's no such thing as empirical verification, unless you relate it to an intellect, because it's the intellect that knows truth.
One thing I've learned from talking with Peter is that he's an organizational Thomist.
Okay.
But I wonder if Peter or you, Curtis, I wonder if you would be okay with the term existential Thomism.
Oh, yes, I would. I think it reminds us that with St. Thomas, there's a break from essentialism, the Platonism and even the Aristotelianism, which says to be real is just to be an essence. And St. Thomas saw that won't fly because an essence is just a possibility. The essence of a unicorn is what it is, but that doesn't mean a unicorn exists. So there has to be some real constitutive principle in something that makes an essence exist. And existential Thomism, seems to me, it does justice to that profound insight, which really drives Thomistic metaphysics.
Yeah, it is, but it doesn't go far enough. This is the mistake that Gilson made. There are more principles in St. Thomas that you have to understand in order to apprehend what he's doing than the fact that the existence of something is distinct from its essence or nature. What the essence makes intelligible how something is one, where it gets its unity from, right? And the existence posits something, causes something to be outside nothing, right? To have the essence has the existence and so constitutes a nature. But St. Thomas's teaching is unintelligible unless you recognize that he considers all real beings to exist within real genera and to be divided by species according to unequal possession of a perfection, virtual quantity, relation, opposition. Okay, St. Thomas is teaching about opposition, the difference between contrary opposition, contradictory opposition, relation, possession and privation, are largely ignored by contemporary Thomists, and you cannot understand what St. Thomas is talking about regarding the nature of philosophy, regarding the nature of science, unless you understand those principles. 99% of the Thomists, people who call themselves Thomists today, have never studied these principles in St. Thomas. They can't articulate them. And as a result,
so Thomism, rightly understood, is existential, but it's all sorts of other things as well. It's organizational, certainly organizational.
Right.
Now,
it's an organizational existentialism.
Right. Now, once we start to talk about organizations, you guys knew I was going to go in this direction. Once we start to talk about organization, well, heck, we're already talking about politics, at least by way of implication. And our program is called The Open Door, and people keep coming through that open door. And there's a bunch of people involved with the American Solidarity Party, sometimes called the rivulet of the future. The American Solidarity Party thinks that it offers a real way past the great political divides of our day. And I think they're right, but I think that they'll be able to articulate the path between what's called right and left, conservative and progressive, and all these tired distinctions. I think they'll be able to do that only if they're metaphysically astute, or at least metaphysically literate. Can you, as Thomists, say something about how getting politics right involves getting metaphysics right, or at least getting on the road to getting metaphysics right is necessarily for getting on the road to getting politics right? I'd be delighted if you could comment on those questions.
Well, when I hear the word solidarity, I think about John Paul II.
Yes.
And
we call it the American Solidarity Party just so people don't confuse it with Polish solidarity. That's not quite right, but...
I know, but it's that personalism. Aristotle defined the human person as a zoon politikon. We're not just some atomistic entity. We live in such a way that in order to be happy, we have to be interrelated. And so if we lose our sense of what it is to be a person, then ethics will be disordered and politics will be dysfunctional. Because as goes one's philosophy of the human person, so goes one's ethics and so goes one's politics. And the problem with the modern world is they've lost that sense of real relations we talked about later, which is anchored in personhood.
So critical, at least in terms of our discussion so far, is there are relations. There are relations among persons. It's in the context of those relations among persons that we do philosophy, that we do metaphysics. And in the doing of metaphysics, we, as it were, reveal the person as radically distinctive. And insofar as the person is relational, we can begin to talk about community in a robust sort of a way. Are those all legitimate connections?
Yeah, that's why you have to give priority to the civil society and the common good more than just the government. The government consists of people who look at the world their metaphysics is you just look at the world as just bits of atomic parts, and human beings are among those atomic parts, and they just want to engineer and manage that and arrange that. But they've lost the sense that the individual
what Dr. Hancock is indicating is how they tend to look at our awareness of things in terms of discrete, unrelated parts. Exactly. You can't get to this personalism unless you return to the faculty psychology. Western culture, Enlightenment politics, has lost its understanding of the person as an integrated whole because they've lost the understanding of the human soul as possessed of faculties. They don't even recognize the existence of the human soul. This is true psychologically among most Catholics as well as everybody else, including clerics. They've lost an understanding of the soul, right? and how through the faculties of the soul, the divisions and methods of scientific and artistic thinking are developed. The knower and the thing known belong to the same genus. They belong to the same organizational whole. When we're studying different sciences and so on, we're studying our knowledge of this or that organization and the way it acts, the way it operates. To regain the personalism, you really have to regain an understanding of the faculty psychology with the different habits. It's the habits, the psychological habits of the person in which you find the methods of the sciences, right? The sciences and the arts being related to different types of organizations and different habits of understanding, qualitatively different habits by means of which we recognize their parts in the way they operate one with another. If you don't get back to that, this is why Enlightenment politics is anarchic and why it's collapsing around us today.
Okay, now how about this? It's been said by more than one commentator that both right and left, and both the communist and the capitalist, and I make a distinction between capitalism and true free market economies, that both right and left, both capitalist and communist, really accept a kind of understanding of man as economic man, homo economicus. But we have to go far beyond that. We have to have a much richer philosophy of man. And I think John Paul II certainly knew something about solidarity. John Paul II says, in order to really understand solidarity and in order to have an active, intelligent, clarifying philosophical anthropology, we have to be, guess what, metaphysically alive. And he talks about the importance of being, and he does so in very practical encyclicals. He doesn't hesitate to do metaphysics. As one more kind of metaphysical consideration in politics, the American Solidarity Party talks about subsidiarity. And I guess easy way of talking about it, easy pop way of talking about it is, well, subsidiarity says grassroots first, which isn't to say first and last, but grassroots first. But now here's a metaphysical insight, and I really am in debt to John Finnis for this metaphysical insight. We have as a perfectly cross-reality axiom, everything perfects itself or is perfected in act. Omne ens perficitur in actu. And the citizen, it seems, can't really realize his or her potential unless the citizen acts. And insofar as the action of the citizen is squelched by bureaucracy, by technology that is divorced from human life and would want to dominate human life, unless we have active citizenship, we can't really hope for a sensible, sane, humane political order. And what does this come down to? Well, I think it comes down to a metaphysical point. Everything realizes its potential in act. Now, a whole lot of the act has to come from without, but a whole lot of the act has to come from within. And and if you're okay with those thoughts, a further thought would be this notion of what I call, and some people in the Solidarity Party I think would be happy, some would say, I'm not sure what you mean, economic democracy. In the state, I give California examples. In the state of California, if you're going to be a serious candidate to become a senator, you have to let everybody know ahead of time that you've got a $50 million war chest.
Yeah, wow.
Now, that's just basic. We've got right now check the stats, over 800 people who have declared that they're running for presidency of the United States. Well, over 800 officially declared people. Now, those 800, maybe 10 have the economic foundation to make a plausible campaign. But what I'm getting at in economic democracy is that we don't realize our potential unless we can act. We can't act unless we have some, in many cases, we can't act unless we have some economic resources. But in fact, most of us don't have the economic resources necessary to function in the political sphere. So what a lot of us do is we shake our heads. What the hell is going on, and how could anybody do anything about it anyway? And that
ideas have consequences, and you're right. They've displaced the individual's action in terms for the sake of social structures and social systems. Even in the archdiocese where I live, they've just created an office of social justice in the archdiocese. Not an office of justice or Christian justice, an office of social justice. And that social justice language is a Marxist trope. But once this language becomes accepted, and what does the idea of social justice imply? Is that justice is no longer the action of the individual, which you're referring to, Jim, the cultivation of virtue and the avoidance of vice. It's basically trying to modify institutions and structures.
Yeah, but the action of individuals in community, we think of Maritanne's classic work, the person and the common good. You know what, people, I'm going to give everybody one last round because we're down to 1 minute left, and because this is a podcast, we can keep class a bit late.
Okay,
we're coming to the end.
In terms of the political parties, Jim, you're right. The Republican and Democrat parties, the leading parties, they're both controlled by the international bankers and the law firms, for one thing, and they are they're two extremes of the same genus. Okay, and this is why they tend to constantly, with respect to major positions on different major issues, wind up adopting the same sort of position. So you have to do a Hail Mary pass over these organizations and groups, and you can't just form another political party to do this unless you understand your situation, unless you understand the nature of politics and the way it operates in general.
And that's what we're here for, right?
And metaphysics. It really can. You have to understand the human person, because all science, all activities are generated by persons and
right.
Civilization and cultural enterprises that are enabled to come into existence and historically cooperate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I just want to say, and this is just about the last thing I'm going to say other than the great prayer of the gospel in the context of the liturgy. If a person were to go to the WCAT radio group, The Open Door, a person could find, I think, a very accessible and engaging and modest and kind of fun presentation of distributism, which I think we can trace back to the encyclicals of the popes in Rerum Novarum and Quadragesimo Anno, and certainly in something like Laborum Exercens of John Paul II. A short clip from John Madai, and you just go to our website and click on it, and John's got his suspenders on, and he's a lot of fun, so I want to recommend that. That said, I want to close, as we always try to do, with the gospel from today's liturgy, Friday the 26th. And this is from the Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, "Hear the parable of the sower. The seed sown on the path is the one who hears the word of the kingdom without understanding it. And the evil one comes and steals away what was sown in his heart. The seed sown on rocky ground is the one who hears the word and receives it at once with joy, but he has no root and lasts only for a time. When some tribulation or persecution comes because of the word, he immediately falls away. The seed sown among the thorns is the one who hears the word, but then worldly anxiety and the lure of riches choke the word, and it bears no fruit. But the seed sown on rich soil is the one who hears the word and understands it, who indeed bears fruit and yields 100 or 60 or 30-fold. The word of the Lord. All right. Thanks to everyone who's joined us, and thanks, of course, to our dear friends Peter and Curtis. And we'll be back next week. Give us a listen.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.